While most 5-year-olds are learning to read or playing in backyards, Noah Caldwell hasn't said a single word in 8 months, not since he watched his mother's casket lowered into the ground. In a mansion filled with silence, his father, Ethan, buries himself in work, believing grief is something to outrun. But everything changes the day a new housekeeper arrives. A young woman with no credentials, no degrees, just a quiet presence and a past she never speaks of. Keep watching to see how a single laugh sparked a journey of healing and hope. What begins as a simple job turns into something far greater. One small moment, a laugh, a look, a single word will unlock a bond no one saw coming. But healing comes with choices. And not everyone is ready to face the cost of love. Stay with us as we tell a story of loss, trust, and the power of showing up when it matters most. And before we begin, what's the one thing you think a child needs most to heal? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Ethan Caldwell wasn't supposed to be home. His flight from Seattle had been canceled last minute, and instead of rescheduling or calling his assistant, he simply ordered a car and left the airport in silence. He hadn't told anyone, not the house staff, not his driver, not even the nanny service. Maybe part of him just wanted to walk into his empty house and sit in the solitude he'd grown so used to. He imagined his usual return, the cold air of the front hall, the eerie stillness, the soft echo of his own footsteps, and Noah, always in his room, quiet as a ghost. It had been like that for 8 months since Helena's funeral. Noah had stopped speaking, stopped laughing, stopped being. And Ethan, already drowning in guilt for surviving that car crash, found it easier to bury himself in work than face his son's silence. So when he opened the front door and stepped inside, he was already preparing himself for more of the same, absence disguised as normalcy. But then he heard it: laughter. Noah's laughter. Sharp, sudden, wild, pure. He froze, every muscle in his body stiffening as if hearing something forbidden. His heart stumbled over a beat. No, it couldn't be. He stood in the middle of the hall, briefcase slipping from his fingers, shoes forgotten on marble. It wasn't the ghost of a sound or a memory misfiring. It was real. The laughter wasn't just noise. It had rhythm. It had life. Noah was laughing and someone else was laughing with him. He followed the sound instinctively, not even realizing he was walking until he reached the archway that opened into the indoor garden. What he saw didn't make sense, not to his grief-hardened mind, not to the version of reality he had crafted to survive. Noah, his 5-year-old, once vibrant, now silent son, was straddling the back of a woman, holding on to her shoulders, giggling so loudly that his whole body trembled. The woman was down on all fours, crawling like a horse, her long dark hair tied up, a loose strand falling over her cheek as she turned slightly, her expression lit with something Ethan hadn't seen in months: joy. That woman was Riley, the housekeeper he had hired without much care, just someone to keep things clean, cook, and be invisible. She wasn't supposed to engage like this, but she wasn't following any unspoken rules. She had broken straight through them. Noah's laughter came in bursts, so full it made him gasp between giggles. Riley let out a playful neigh, shaking her shoulders, so Noah bounced gently and he squealed with delight. Ethan couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, his lungs refusing air. This wasn't just a rare moment of joy. It was a resurrection. This was the boy he remembered from before the accident. The boy who would run to the door when he came home from business trips, who climbed into Helena's lap to read books and talked endlessly about dinosaurs. This was his son, and it felt like watching a ghost come back to life in slow motion. Riley glanced up, catching sight of Ethan standing there, but her smile didn't falter. She didn't look guilty or startled, just calm, present. Her hands gently steadied Noah as she stopped crawling, letting him climb down slowly, one foot at a time, never rushing, never instructing. She said something to him that Ethan couldn't hear. Noah turned, still breathing hard from laughing, and saw his father. His smile didn't fade. Instead, his little feet took 3 wobbly steps toward Ethan, just like that. Ethan's knees buckled as he caught Noah in his arms. The boy's body was warm, solid, so much lighter than he remembered, not from size but from how long it had been since he'd held him like this. Noah buried his face into Ethan's chest, giggling once more. That sound, sharp and miraculous, rattled inside Ethan's chest like a long-lost song. He looked up at Riley, still crouched on the ground, and words failed him. She didn't rush to explain. She didn't try to justify what he had just witnessed. She simply wiped her hands on her jeans and said softly, "Hi." It wasn't a greeting. It was a declaration of presence. Ethan's mouth opened, but only one question escaped, hoarse and almost childlike. What is this?" Riley didn't answer right away. She let Noah wrap his small arms tighter around his father's neck. Let the silence speak before breaking it gently. "It's just play," she said. "That's all he needed." Ethan stared at her, stunned. His son, who hadn't spoken, laughed, moved freely in almost a year, was breathing into his neck like nothing had ever been broken. Still holding Noah, Ethan slowly lowered himself onto the bench beneath the ivy-covered archway. The boy was starting to calm now, fingers absently rubbing the fabric of Ethan's jacket. There were so many questions clawing at his throat. Why now? How? What had she done that all the professionals couldn't? But when he looked back at Riley, he couldn't form any of them. She sat across from him without waiting to be invited. Her legs crossed, posture relaxed, as if this moment didn't scare her like it did him. "I didn't try to fix him," she said before he could ask anything. "I just listened. He told me what he needed in his way." Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands trembling as he held his son close. He wanted to deny it, to call it luck, coincidence, timing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This woman had reached a place in Noah that he had lost the map to. And somehow, by doing less, by simply being there, she had given him back something Ethan thought he had buried with Helena. "You're not just a maid," he whispered. Riley gave a small shrug. "I'm not trying to be anything, just someone who didn't walk past him." Ethan looked down at Noah, now resting quietly against his chest, eyelids fluttering as if sleep might come soon. There was no professional title for what Riley had done. No therapy term, no treatment plan. It wasn't measurable, couldn't be charted. It was presence. It was the absence of fear, the absence of abandonment. He thought of the months of silence, of therapy rooms and sterile clinics, of the times he'd stood outside Noah's door and listened to nothing, then turned away. "I was trying to save him with money," Ethan muttered. Riley didn't nod in agreement. She let the words fall and stay between them. "He needed something free," she finally said, and Ethan, for once, didn't try to rationalize it. He looked down at his son, eyes hot with tears he couldn't blink away. Noah's hand gripped his shirt, not in desperation, but trust. Real, simple, unquestioning trust. Ethan tightened his arms around the small boy and for the first time since the accident felt like he wasn't the only one still alive. And then it hit him like the first breath after nearly drowning. This wasn't grief. This was hope. And it was terrifying. Riley didn't apologize. Not when she stood up from the garden floor. Not when she brushed her jeans with casual ease. And not even when Ethan stared at her with a mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to gratitude. She looked at him as if she belonged in that moment. Not as an intruder or employee caught doing something outside her job description, but as someone who saw things others ignored. There was a calmness in her, an unshakable steadiness that unnerved Ethan more than any rebellious nanny or high-handed therapist ever had. Most people danced around his grief or softened their voices to a whisper when speaking of Noah. Riley didn't whisper. She didn't flinch. She acknowledged Ethan's stare and held it with quiet defiance. Not arrogance, just truth. That kind of truth you couldn't fake. He was used to controlling people, contractors, lawyers, boardrooms full of men twice his age. But Riley wasn't interested in being controlled, and she wasn't asking for permission. That unsettled him deeply. But what unsettled him more was how easily Noah had trusted her. That trust hadn't been earned with strategy or promises. It had come naturally, as if Riley had simply sat still long enough for the boy to come to her. Later that evening, after the incident in the garden, Noah fell asleep in record time. There was no struggle, no anxious pacing, no clinging to the door frame with silent dread like usual. He just curled up on his bed, holding the stuffed dinosaur Riley had found in a forgotten toy bin, and drifted off without a sound. Ethan stood outside the boy's bedroom longer than he intended, watching the rise and fall of his son's breath, a kind of awe tightening his chest. Something had shifted, something deep, not just in Noah but in Ethan too. He found himself wondering what had truly happened out there in the garden beyond the laughter. What had Riley done differently? Was it just timing, a fluke, or had she tapped into something no one else bothered to reach? He went to his office, poured himself a drink, and replayed the moment over and over in his head. That laugh, that look on Noah's face, the way Riley didn't flinch under scrutiny. It wasn't professional skill that had reached his son. It was presence, something he himself hadn't offered in months. Ethan wasn't ready to confront that realization out loud. Not yet. But it stayed with him the next day as he moved through the house like a ghost in his own home. He kept expecting the magic to break, for Noah to return to the boy who never spoke, never reacted. But instead, Noah followed Riley around like a shadow. Quiet, yes, but alert, observant, always watching. He didn't speak, but he responded. When she hummed, he tapped his fingers. When she told him to pick a color, he pointed. When she sat on the floor, he sat beside her. Ethan watched all of it from a distance, not wanting to interrupt whatever strange trust had blossomed between them. Riley never once acted like she noticed Ethan standing in doorways or hallways. She didn't perform for him, didn't narrate what she was doing like the therapists had. She just existed with Noah, and that simplicity was jarring. He realized with a mix of shame and confusion that he didn't know how to just be with his own son. Riley did effortlessly. She didn't treat Noah like a problem to solve. She treated him like a person waiting to be heard. There was a moment mid-afternoon when Ethan walked into the kitchen and found Riley helping Noah arrange pieces of fruit into animal shapes on his plate. She didn't look up when Ethan entered. She just handed Noah a banana and said, "What do you think? Is that a giraffe or a goose?" Noah grinned. Ethan almost dropped the coffee mug in his hand. "Is he smiling?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. Riley finally looked up at him, amused but not mocking. "Of course he is," she said simply. "Smiling isn't broken." Her answer wasn't sarcastic, but it landed harder than any insult. Ethan didn't respond. He just nodded and left the room, ashamed that his own surprise had betrayed how little he expected joy from his son anymore. That night, he lay in bed thinking about that smile, thinking about how Riley hadn't once tried to impress him. She wasn't performing a miracle for his benefit. She was just giving Noah something real, and by extension showing Ethan everything he'd stopped giving. Ethan began to observe Riley with sharper attention, not in a controlling way but with curiosity that bordered on reverence. Who was this woman who had walked into his grief-drenched world and cracked open the silence without asking for anything? She hadn't presented a resume full of credentials, hadn't claimed expertise in child development or trauma. She hadn't even accepted the full-time nanny title he'd offered off-handedly during her interview. "I'm just here to help with the house," she had said. But clearly she was helping with far more. What made her different wasn't just how she handled Noah. It was how she saw people, really saw them. She wasn't trying to fix anyone. She listened, waited, responded. There was something radical in her stillness. something disarming in her lack of ambition to be a savior. Ethan didn't know how to process it, so he watched from behind doors, from the top of staircases, from corners she didn't look toward, and without noticing it, Riley began to observe Ethan too. Not the man in tailored suits or polished shoes, but the man who stood silently behind glass windows, trying to remember what it meant to be someone's father. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear. Ethan stopped pretending he wasn't watching, and Riley stopped pretending she didn't notice. They existed in a strange rhythm, him learning how to be present without interfering, her allowing his quiet presence without inviting it. They never spoke directly about what was happening. They didn't need to. It was written in glances, in the way Ethan lingered a little longer near the kitchen doorway, or how Riley would leave art supplies out on the table even after Noah was done, knowing Ethan would pass by and see the traces of his son's play. One night, Ethan stood at the living room entrance, watching as Riley read to Noah, not from a book, but a story she was inventing aloud with dragons and trees that talked. Noah was curled against her side, silent but deeply attentive. Ethan's chest tightened. She hadn't forced her way into their lives. She had simply listened to a child's silence, to a man's distance, and waited for both to come back to life. Ethan didn't say anything, but that night he sat at his desk and wrote one sentence in a notebook he hadn't touched in months. She knew how to listen, and somehow that was enough. Riley never pushed. She didn't beg Noah to speak or coax him with questions he couldn't answer. She didn't use games as tests or try to catch breakthroughs like butterflies in a jar. Instead, she spoke to him like she would any other child, naturally, warmly, without the heavy air of expectations. She told stories that made no sense in the best ways possible. There were dragons who cried when people picked flowers, talking foxes who taught math in the forest, and a lonely castle that had no queen, but kept its lights on just in case one ever came back. Noah never replied, but his eyes followed every word. He nodded at certain parts, smiled faintly at others. Riley noticed every flicker of emotion like they were full sentences. She left little drawings next to his pillow every night, tiny stick figure adventures of a boy and a girl slaying invisible monsters together. Sometimes Noah would carry one around all day, and Ethan watched this unfolding world from the sidelines, unsure if he was witnessing magic or something painfully simple, someone seeing his son without trying to change him. And what gnawed at him more than the wonder of it all was the quiet shame that he hadn't known how to do any of it. The shame wasn't loud. It was subtle, slow. Ethan carried it like a dull ache beneath his ribs. He didn't resent Riley. How could he? Watching her with Noah was like watching someone discover a secret garden in a place he'd spent months bulldozing. But admiration came with a cost. Every time Noah responded to Riley, every time he reached for her hand, showed her a crayon, or sat beside her without hesitation, Ethan felt the sting of what he'd missed, what he'd allowed to slip through his fingers while drowning in bored meetings and grief he wore like armor. He remembered the weeks after Helena's death when he'd locked himself in his office, delegating Noah's care like he was delegating furniture removal, cold, efficient, removed. He told himself he was protecting Noah from his brokenness, but maybe deep down it had been the opposite. Maybe he'd been too afraid to see his son's pain because it mirrored his own too clearly. Riley didn't flinch from that pain. She invited it in. She sat with it, unbothered, letting it pass like weather. Ethan didn't understand how she did it, but he watched. Every day he watched more closely. Noah was opening slowly, subtly, not like a door being swung open, but like a flower risking its first bloom. He started bringing Riley small things. A red block, a leaf, a cracker from his snack. Nothing grand, but the intent was there. I trust you. I want to share. One morning, Riley was drawing with him when she said, "Maybe tomorrow we'll write a letter to the moon. Ask her why she never comes during the day." Noah didn't reply, but he drew a circle, filled it with stars, and pointed to it. Riley smiled, not making it a big deal, not praising him like a breakthrough, just nodded and whispered, "She'll love that." Ethan saw all of it from the hall. He felt like a man outside his own house watching his child communicate in ways he hadn't known were possible. There was no therapy plan, no reward system, just connection. Real, pure, unspoken connection, the kind he hadn't dared to try forming because he was terrified of doing it wrong. But Riley was showing him that there was no right way. There was only showing up again and again, even in silence. Dinner became something Ethan anticipated rather than endured. Riley would cook with Noah beside her, sometimes on a stool, other times crouched on the floor organizing spoons or stacking napkins. They didn't speak, but they existed together in perfect rhythm. Occasionally, Riley would slide Ethan a plate and say, "Noah helped with this part." And it didn't matter what it was, it became sacred. One night when Riley excused herself after dinner, Ethan cleared the plates alone. Noah stood by the sink watching him, a sponge in his hand. Ethan bent down, not speaking, and offered his palm. Noah placed the sponge in it gently, then patted off without a word. Ethan held that moment like a glass sculpture, afraid to drop it. Later, he passed Riley in the hallway. "He handed me a sponge," he said, almost laughing at himself. Riley looked at him, then just said, "It means he's letting you in," and walked away. No fanfare, no analysis, just truth placed in his hands as lightly as the sponge had been. Ethan leaned against the wall for a long time after that, wondering how many other things his son had said without ever opening his mouth. It was the smallness of the moments that made them unforgettable. Riley never overstayed in them, never tried to wring meaning from things Noah wasn't ready to give. She was gentle with him in ways that Ethan was still learning to be, with space, with time, with silence. Ethan started sitting in the same room when they played, pretending to read or check his phone, but really just trying to understand the rhythm between them. Riley never commented on his presence, but once she did say without looking up, "You can draw too, even if you're bad at it." He chuckled dryly, then picked up a crayon and drew a wobbly tree. Noah looked over, blinked, and handed Ethan the green one. No words, just an offering. It nearly broke Ethan's heart. That was how it was. Noah gave in gestures, and every gesture was sacred. Ethan stopped trying to measure progress in words or milestones. He started seeing what Riley had seen all along. Connection wasn't always spoken. It was built in presence, patience, and the quiet choice to stay even when nothing was being said. That night, something shifted. Ethan had wandered into the living room, expecting to see the usual scene, Riley reading or straightening things while Noah played quietly nearby. But what he found was different. Riley and Noah were both lying on the rug, their heads nearly touching. Crayons and paper spread across the floor like a spilled rainbow. Noah wasn't just coloring. He was focused, drawing deliberately. Ethan approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt, and sat near the edge of the rug, unsure of his place. He didn't say a word, just watched. After a few minutes, Noah looked up, then slid his paper over without a sound. Ethan picked it up. It showed 3 figures, crudely drawn, one taller, one medium, one small. 3 stick figures holding hands. One had long hair, one had a tie, one had a dinosaur shirt. Ethan stared at it, unable to breathe. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't detailed, but it was them. It was family. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan didn't feel like a stranger in his own story. He looked at Noah, who looked back, not smiling, not speaking, but present. And in that moment, Ethan felt it deeply, unshakably. He was still a father. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Riley stumbled across the door. She hadn't been looking for it, just chasing down a rogue sock Noah had flung across the hallway during one of their makeshift laundry basketball games. The sock slid beneath a door she hadn't noticed before. It looked like all the others on the second floor, White painted frame, brass handle, nothing distinct. But when she tried the knob, it didn't budge. Locked. Odd, considering none of the other rooms ever were. She leaned in, listening, habit, curiosity, instinct, but heard nothing. No ticking clock, no ventilation hum, just a kind of stillness. Later that morning, while pouring juice for Noah at the kitchen island, she asked Ethan casually, without any pointed tone, "Hey, the door at the end of the upstairs hallway, what's in there?" The moment the words left her lips, something in Ethan's expression shut down, like someone had flipped a switch and turned the light out behind his eyes. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the countertop like it had insulted him. Then he said, low and clipped, "Nobody goes in there." She waited for more, but none came. His tone was final, the kind of final that didn't allow follow-up. Riley didn't ask again. She knew how to read silence, and Ethan's wasn't empty. It was thick, full of grief he hadn't invited her into. She nodded once, said nothing more, and shifted the conversation to grocery delivery without missing a beat. But inside, the question lingered. She wasn't interested in secrets for the sake of gossip or morbid curiosity. It was the weight in Ethan's voice, the tremble in the quiet that followed that made her wonder what that room had taken from him, or what it was still holding hostage. That night, after Noah fell asleep, curled against his stuffed dinosaur, Riley sat on the floor of her bedroom, legs crossed, a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Her mind drifted to the closed door and the man who had locked it, not just physically, but emotionally. Ethan wasn't cold. That was the mistake most people would make. He was scared, of memory, of feeling, of breaking apart in front of someone who might not know what to do with the pieces. Riley understood that kind of fear all too well, but she also knew something else. Silence, left unchecked, doesn't preserve you. It buries you. She didn't make a plan or tell herself she'd fix anything. Riley didn't believe people needed to be fixed, but she did believe in presence, in reminders that some doors didn't have to stay sealed forever. So, after brushing her teeth and checking on Noah one last time, she walked quietly back up the stairs. She stood outside the closed room for a long moment, hands at her sides. She didn't try the handle again. Instead, she went back downstairs to the kitchen. She poured a glass of milk and warmed it the way her grandmother used to for her after nightmares. She placed it carefully on a small ceramic saucer and returned upstairs. Then she took a pen and a small piece of notepaper from her pocket. She didn't overthink the words. She just wrote what she felt, plain, simple, real. She placed the note under the saucer, aligned it perfectly with the door, then turned and left without knocking. No drama, no symbolism, just an offering, a message. A moment left like an open hand. You don't have to open it. Just don't keep it closed forever. The note didn't move for hours. Riley checked once at midnight and saw it untouched. She wasn't surprised. Healing doesn't happen on cue, but something told her it had been seen, read, felt. The next morning it was gone. The saucer had been taken inside, the milk untouched but not returned, and the note nowhere. That evening, Ethan didn't mention it. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask her anything about it. But when they crossed paths in the hallway, something in his posture had shifted. Shoulders less tense, jaw unclenched, eyes softer if only slightly. Riley didn't push. She simply smiled and walked past him, trusting that sometimes the smallest gestures said the loudest things. Later that night, she heard him walking upstairs long after Noah had fallen asleep. His steps paused outside the room, then continued down the hall. Again, no words, just presence. But the seed had been planted, and she knew better than anyone how slow roots took hold when growing through grief. It wasn't until 3 nights later that Ethan allowed himself to stop. He had been pacing the hallway outside the door for over an hour, debating something he couldn't put into words. He wasn't sure what scared him more, opening the door or admitting why he couldn't. The room had been Helena's, untouched, preserved. The day after her funeral, he'd locked it like a vault, swearing to himself he'd keep it exactly as it was. Her books, her scarves draped over chairs, the perfume still resting on the vanity as if memory could be protected by keeping it sealed away. But memory had become a weight, not a shrine. He placed his palm flat against the wood and let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for months. Then slowly he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the door. Not to open it, not yet, just to touch it, just to let himself be close, without pretending it didn't exist. And there, alone in the dark hallway with no audience, no performance, Ethan Caldwell cried for the first time since the day she died. He didn't cry loudly. He didn't fall apart. But the tears were real, slow, steady. They came from a place so deep he'd forgotten it existed. He stayed like that for a long time, forehead to wood, hands hanging loosely at his sides, breath hitching every few seconds as old grief surfaced in gentle waves. It wasn't an explosion. It was a release, a soft undoing. And through it all, Riley didn't come upstairs. She didn't check. She didn't intrude because she understood something most people missed. Not all healing needs an audience. Some wounds close better in private with only the silence to witness them. When Ethan finally stepped back from the door, eyes swollen and throat raw, he saw the faint outline of a milk ring on the floor where the saucer had sat days before. It was gone now, but the message remained. You don't have to open it, just don't keep it closed forever. He looked down at his hand, then back at the door. It was still closed, and that was okay for now. It started as nothing, just a forgotten plastic box buried beneath a pile of old toys in the storage bench. Noah had been rummaging through it while Riley folded laundry on the couch. She wasn't paying much attention, just humming softly as she worked until she heard the distinct click of a button. She looked over and saw Noah holding something unfamiliar, his little fingers exploring its buttons with curiosity. "Where did you find that?" she asked gently, crossing the room to kneel beside him. Noah turned the device in his hand, confused but fascinated. Riley took it, inspected it, and smiled faintly. "It's a voice recorder. Really old school," she added with a chuckle. "People used these to record their voices before phones did everything." Noah looked at her, expression unreadable, and pointed at the small compartment underneath. Riley opened it, found a corroded pair of batteries, and tossed them in the trash. "Tell you what," she said, rising to her feet. "Give me 10 minutes, and I'll see if we've got new ones." She returned with fresh batteries, clicked them into place, and showed Noah how to press the red button to record and the black one to play it back. His eyes lit up like she just handed him something magical. For the rest of the afternoon, the recorder didn't leave Noah's hands. He followed Riley around the house with it tucked against his chest like a secret. At first, he only pressed buttons, listening to the soft, mechanical whir, fascinated by the play and record cycle. Riley didn't interrupt or direct him. She let him explore, occasionally pointing out how to rewind or fast forward. She told him he could record anything, sounds, thoughts, even silence. "Sometimes silence is the most honest sound," she whispered, not expecting him to understand but meaning it anyway. Ethan noticed the new device that evening and raised an eyebrow. "You gave him that?" he asked. Riley nodded. "It was his find. I just gave it power." Ethan didn't ask more, but he watched as Noah clutched it like a lifeline, as if the recorder might catch something he himself was too afraid to voice. Later that night, after dinner, Riley saw Noah sitting under the staircase, hunched over the recorder in his lap. She didn't disturb him. She simply walked past, meeting Ethan's glance across the hall. "He's just playing," she said, but something in her voice trembled as if she knew it wasn't just that. Noah waited until the house had gone still. Riley had tucked him in and kissed his forehead like she always did. Ethan had lingered in the doorway longer than usual before whispering a quiet, "Good night, buddy." But now the lights were out and the world was quieter, and Noah crept out of bed without a sound. He moved like a shadow. recorder clutched in his hand, tiptoeing down the stairs until he reached the landing where the stairwell curved and offered a hidden pocket of space. There he crouched and held the recorder close. His thumb hovered over the red button for a long moment. He stared at it, chest rising and falling faster than usual, like the weight of a single choice was too big for his tiny lungs. And then, slowly, he pressed it. There was a click, a pause, and then, so quietly it barely registered, Riley. His voice was scratchy, hesitant, barely above a breath. But it was his voice, the first word he had spoken in nearly 9 months. He stared at the recorder as if shocked by his own sound, then quickly pressed stop. He didn't replay it. He just hugged the device to his chest and sat there in silence. The next morning, Riley found the recorder on the kitchen counter beside Noah's cereal bowl. She thought nothing of it at first, just another toy, another quiet trace of his curiosity. She picked it up casually, intending to set it aside, but something made her thumb hover over the black play button. A hunch, a whisper in her own chest. She pressed it. A small mechanical click echoed from the speaker, followed by a few seconds of silence, then her name. Riley. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear, but it was real. Her knees gave out before she realized they were buckling. She sank to the floor, recorder still in her hand, eyes wide with disbelief. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. Her other hand pressed over her mouth like it might hold the emotion back. It didn't. She sat there in the middle of the tiled kitchen floor, cradling that little piece of plastic like it was a newborn. Noah's voice, his voice, was still playing in her ears over and over, like a sacred loop. She didn't call out to him. She didn't make a scene. She just wept quietly and completely, and it wasn't a miracle. It was something even rarer, trust. When Ethan came downstairs a few minutes later, still tugging at the sleeves of his shirt, he froze at the sight of her on the floor. "Riley?" he asked, confused, rushing forward. She held up the recorder without a word, her fingers trembling. "He said my name," she whispered. "Last night, he said it." Ethan stared at her, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then he took the recorder, pressed play, and heard it, raw, soft, unmistakably Noah. The man who had endured months of silence, who had stood beside therapists explaining that his son might never speak again, now stood frozen by a single word, his breath caught in his throat. "Jesus," he whispered, eyes shining. Riley nodded, wiping her face, trying to pull herself together. "It wasn't a fluke," she said quietly. "He knew what he was doing." Ethan looked toward the hallway, knowing exactly where Noah was, probably sitting, probably watching. "What do we do?" he asked. Riley looked up at him, steady despite her tears. "We don't rush it. We don't make it a spectacle. We just keep showing up." Ethan nodded slowly, the recorder still in his hand, the word Riley still echoing in his chest like a promise. That afternoon, the recorder stayed on the counter, untouched. Riley didn't mention it. Noah didn't ask about it, but when she handed him a snack later and said, "You can borrow it again any time you want," he looked at her for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod. That was it. No hugs, no drama. Just a boy who had whispered one name into the dark and the woman who had waited months to hear it. It wasn't the end. It wasn't even the turning point. But it was a beginning. A real one. A crack in the wall that had kept Noah's voice buried beneath grief. And maybe that's all healing ever was. One word spoken in the dark that finally reached the light. Ethan should have felt proud. That's what everyone would say. "Your son is getting better." They'd nod. "You must feel relieved." But he wasn't. He was terrified. Every moment Noah grew more open, more emotionally present. Ethan felt something clawing at the back of his throat. It wasn't rejection. It was fear. He had spent so long being unneeded, so long hidden behind work and grief, and the cold armor of responsibility that being invited back into his son's life felt like standing on unstable ground. What if he failed? What if Noah regressed because of him? What if he couldn't meet his son where he was, not the way Riley could? Love wasn't safe. Presence wasn't safe. Business, however, business made sense. Contracts, deliverables, flights, calendars. The next morning, he stood in front of the kitchen counter, watching Riley and Noah quietly work through a color-coded schedule of chores for the day. The simplicity of it made him feel like an outsider in his own home. "I need to go to New York," he said abruptly, not quite making eye contact. Riley nodded once. "Work," he nodded. "When?" "Tonight." She paused, then said, "I'll make sure Noah's okay." That was the problem. She would, with or without him. He tried not to feel like a coward as he packed. It wasn't as if he was running away, he told himself. It was a scheduled meeting with potential investors. He hadn't left the state in months. This wasn't avoidance. It was balance. Still, as he zipped the bag shut, a flicker of guilt passed through his chest. Noah had said a word, just one. He'd whispered Riley into a recorder, and instead of building from that moment, Ethan was retreating. He tried to silence the thought. Riley had it handled. She always did. Still, something in the house felt different that afternoon. Noah wasn't as engaged. He drifted through the hours like he sensed something was off. Riley didn't mention the trip again. She didn't try to change Ethan's mind. She simply carried on. Meals, stories, moments of presence. But as Ethan came downstairs with his suitcase that night, Noah was nowhere to be found. "He's in the consequential playroom," Riley said softly. "Didn't want dinner." Ethan hesitated. "Did you tell him I was leaving?" "No," she replied, but he knew. That landed heavier than he expected. He didn't ask how. Children always knew. As Ethan stepped into the hallway to grab his briefcase, he noticed something sticking out from one of the side pockets. It was paper, folded, crinkled, messy, like it had been rushed. He pulled it out slowly, already knowing who had left it. A drawing. Crayon lines, jagged and heavy, made up the shape of an airplane. Bright red flames came from the tail. Beneath the plane, a small stick figure stood on the ground, arms stretched upward, tears drawn in thick blue lines falling from the eyes. Next to the figure, two simple words: "Noah sad." Ethan's breath left his lungs before he could control it. He stared at the drawing for a long time, unable to move. The crude picture said more than Noah ever could in speech. He wasn't asking his father to stay. He wasn't begging. He was feeling and trusting Ethan enough to show him. That broke something, or maybe it rebuilt something that had long been fractured. Slowly, Ethan folded the drawing and placed it back in the briefcase. Then he zipped it shut, carried it back upstairs, and set it inside the closet. He wouldn't need it. He found Noah curled up under a blanket in the corner of the playroom, a dinosaur clutched tightly in one hand. The boy didn't look up when Ethan walked in, but Ethan didn't expect him to. He sat down beside him on the rug, unsure what to say. He'd rehearsed speeches before, about grief, about how hard it had been, about how work helped him cope, but none of that felt right now. Instead, he simply said, "I saw your picture." Noah's fingers tensed slightly around the plush toy. Ethan continued, voice gentler than it had been in months. "I was going to leave. I told myself it was just work, but I think I was scared. You're getting better. You're talking, trusting, growing. And I didn't know if I could be what you needed. But then you showed me that picture, and it made me realize something." Noah turned his head slightly, still silent. Ethan met his eyes. "I don't want to be the dad who always leaves. Not anymore." A long pause followed. Then Noah scooted just slightly closer until his shoulder touched his father's. No words but a gesture, and that was enough. Later that evening, Ethan joined Riley in the kitchen. She was wiping down the counters, the usual calm in her every movement. She didn't look up when he entered. "You missed your flight," she said softly. "I canceled it," Ethan replied. Riley's hand stilled for a moment before continuing. "I figured he's been different since you sat with him." Ethan nodded slowly. "I can't keep running." Riley finally looked up, eyes searching his face. "No," she said gently, "you can't." There was no pride in her voice, no praise, just truth, the kind that didn't need embellishment. He wanted to say thank you, to tell her that the drawing had shattered something cold inside him, that Noah's sadness had pulled him back from the edge of emotional detachment. But instead, he just stood there beside her, shoulders softening, eyes tired, and whispered, "I'm staying." Riley nodded once. "Then he'll know," she said, "even if he never says it." Ethan didn't ask what she meant. Deep down, he already knew. That night, Ethan sat beside Noah's bed while the boy drifted off to sleep, his breathing steady, peaceful. The drawing lay on the nightstand, flattened beneath a small paperweight shaped like a star. Ethan looked at it again, at the burning plane, the crying child, and felt the ache in his chest shift. Not vanish, not heal, but shift. He reached out, placed a hand on Noah's back, and stayed there. No more meetings, no more boardrooms, no more flights. For the first time since everything fell apart, Ethan Caldwell chose to stay, and this time he meant it. Ethan hadn't meant to be outside that long. He'd come out for air, but time had slipped past him unnoticed. The night sky was clear, the kind of clarity that usually brought a sense of calm. But tonight it felt like it asked too many questions. He stood in the garden, eyes locked on the stars, trying to find something familiar in the constellations. A memory, maybe a sign. He heard footsteps behind him and knew it was Riley before she spoke. She always walked with purpose, not like the rest of the staff who floated around him on eggshells. She didn't ask if he wanted company. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked up beside him and looked up at the same sky, silent for a long moment. "There's a boy I never talk about," she said finally, her voice quiet but unshaken. Ethan didn't interrupt. She took a breath and continued. "His name was Jordan. I was his live-in nanny for a little over a year. He was 4, smart, shy, stubborn, and one day he stopped talking." Her hand gripped her wrist tightly as if anchoring herself in the memory. "Just stopped. No medical reason, no trauma they could point to, but I knew he was shutting down." Ethan looked at her then, not with curiosity but with a growing weight of understanding. Riley kept her gaze forward. His parents didn't believe in slowing down. Everything had to be fixed quickly. Behaviorists, speech therapists, all scheduled back to back. He hated every minute of it. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. "I asked them to pause, to just give him space, let him be quiet for a while. They didn't like that, thought I was overstepping." She gave a bitter smile. "They fired me, said I wasn't qualified." Ethan didn't respond. He sensed she wasn't finished. "I told myself I'd go back, maybe a few weeks later, check in, just make sure he was okay." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But he died in the hospital not long after, complications from something unrelated. He was just gone." The silence between them thickened, but not uncomfortably. It was a silence full of weight, of honesty, of grief that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. "I wasn't there when he left," she added, quieter now. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I'll never forgive myself for that." Ethan looked at her profile, strong still, but carrying something ancient behind the eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Every word had already bled enough pain. "I failed him," she said, steady this time. "Not because I didn't care, but because I thought I'd have more time. I thought I could come back and make it right." Her hands dropped to her sides, open. "And when I met Noah, when I saw him for the first time, it was like seeing Jordan again. Not physically, but the silence, the ache in his body, the way he looked past people like he'd already decided no one could reach him." She turned to Ethan, not blinking. "That terrified me. Not because I doubted him, but because I doubted me. I didn't want to lose another child to silence. Not if I could help it." Ethan's mouth parted slightly, but he said nothing. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't feel small. Riley wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't unraveling to be saved. She was telling him why she was here. Not for the job, not for him. For Noah, because there was a time she didn't get to stay and this time she would. "I haven't told anyone about him," Riley said after a long pause. "Not since it happened. There's no obituary with my name in it. No closure. Just this story I carry around like a suitcase I never unpack." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that feeling. He'd been dragging his own grief through every room in this house for months, pretending it wasn't there. But it was. It always was. "You didn't fail him," Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Riley turned her head slightly, waiting. "You were the only one who actually saw him. That matters." She let out a quiet exhale, almost a laugh. "Funny how being seen isn't always enough, though." Ethan didn't argue. They stood like that for a while, shoulder to shoulder beneath a quiet sky, both of them letting old wounds breathe in the open air. Eventually, Riley added, "I didn't come into this house thinking I could fix anything. I just didn't want to look away again." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone who didn't look away. From Noah, from him, from the weight they both carried. There was a long pause before Ethan finally spoke again. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Riley glanced at him, thoughtful. "You weren't ready to hear it," she said simply. "And I wasn't ready to say it." Some stories only surface when the silence feels safe enough. He nodded, absorbing that truth like it belonged to both of them. "Is that why you've stayed?" he asked. "Because of him." Riley looked back at the stars, then down at the earth, then finally at him. "I stayed for Noah," she said. "But yes, part of me stayed for Jordan too. For the chance to do something different this time, to be something different." Ethan didn't know what to do with the ache growing in his chest. Part guilt, part admiration, part something unnameable. He saw her now clearly. Not just the woman who had come into their home and quietly rebuilt what everyone else had written off, but the person underneath, the one carrying invisible loss, unspeakable guilt, and still choosing to show up every day. Not to be a savior, but to be present, consistent human. He didn't say thank you, not because he didn't mean it, but because he knew it would sound too small. So instead, he looked at her like someone finally seeing more than a role, more than a title. He looked at her the way Helena might have looked at someone who made her son laugh again. Not like a housekeeper, not even like a friend, but like a guardian. Someone brave enough to walk into someone else's silence and stay there without demanding an answer. And Riley held his gaze without flinching, without asking for more, because she didn't need to be seen as a hero. She wasn't trying to save anyone. She was simply refusing to walk away a second time. And that, Ethan realized, was the difference. That was what made her matter. Not the way she brought Noah back to life, but the way she stayed because she once couldn't. He didn't speak, but in the way he looked at her, something shifted. For the first time, he saw her fully, not as a woman who changed everything, but as the woman who had once lost everything and still came back. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day where everything seemed to run on routine. Breakfast was quiet but warm. Noah ate all his pancakes, and Riley told him a silly story about a talking giraffe who only ate blueberry muffins. Ethan sat nearby, sipping his coffee, observing the way his son leaned into Riley's words with small smiles and curious eyes. Noah was becoming lighter, more present each day. But even then, words were rare. Since the recorder, he hadn't spoken again. Not Riley, not anything else. Ethan didn't push, neither did Riley. They simply stayed gently, like pillars around him. After breakfast, Ethan answered some emails while Riley set up crayons in the hallway. Noah loved drawing on the floor. It gave him space to spread out and disappear into his own world. Ethan had just stepped out of the office when it happened, so fast, so sudden, he couldn't recall the exact details. A crayon had rolled down the hall. Noah chased it too quickly, and his socked foot slipped on the polished wood. He tumbled hard, landing on his side with a thud and a yelp that cracked something deep in Ethan's chest. The sound was sharp, frightened, real. It wasn't silence anymore. It was pain. Riley was up instantly from the living room, rushing toward them, but Ethan was already there. His legs moved before his brain could catch up. He dropped to his knees beside Noah, who had rolled onto his side, clutching his knee. tears welling fast and heavy. "Hey, hey, SHH," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking before it could be strong. He scooped Noah into his arms without hesitation, feeling the boy's small body trembling against his chest. "SHH, you're okay. Daddy's here. I've got you." The words came out unfiltered, instinctual. He hadn't called himself that in months, not since Helena's death. It had felt like a title he'd forfeited when he'd started disappearing behind walls and schedules. But in that moment, kneeling on the hardwood with his child in his arms, it returned to him like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. Ethan didn't even realize he'd said it aloud until Noah, between broken sobs, pulled back slightly and whispered something almost inaudible. "Daddy." His voice cracked like a twig, shaky, unsure, like it had forgotten how to shape that word, but it came. Ethan froze. His arms stiffened, his breath hitched. For a second he thought he'd imagined it. The hallway was quiet. Riley had stopped mid-step and the only sound was Noah's breathing, shallow and shuddering. But Ethan had heard it. "Daddy," he blinked, eyes suddenly burning. Slowly he looked down at Noah, whose wet eyes were now staring up at him with something uncertain. Hope, fear, recognition. "Did you say?" Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke. Noah didn't answer, but his hand reached up, gripping the collar of Ethan's shirt like he used to back when everything made sense. "You did," Ethan whispered, letting out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "You called me Daddy." He hadn't realized how badly he needed to hear that word again. It wasn't just a name, it was forgiveness, it was invitation. It was Noah letting him back in. He held his son tighter, not because the injury was serious, but because something inside him had broken open. His tears came freely now, no shame, no holding back. "I'm here, buddy." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. And for the first time, he truly meant every syllable. Riley stood a few feet away, unmoving. She had heard it too, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't come closer. Her hands were clenched gently in front of her, and her eyes were full, but she didn't let the emotion spill. This was not her moment. She knew that instinctively. It wasn't her hand Noah had reached for. It wasn't her name he'd called, and that was exactly how it should be. She backed away slowly, step by step, until her figure disappeared behind the curve of the hall. Not to hide. Not because she wasn't part of the journey, but because she understood the difference between guiding a child forward and allowing a father to reclaim what was his. Ethan didn't even notice her go. His entire world had narrowed to the boy in his arms, to the tiny heartbeat pressed against his chest, and the echo of a word that had cracked the silence wide open. He hadn't realized how long he'd been waiting to be seen by his own son again, until now. Noah's sobs slowed gradually. His head settled against Ethan's chest, and his small fingers relaxed, no longer clutching but simply resting. Ethan rocked him gently, still whispering nonsense, just sounds to let the boy know he was there. The hallway felt smaller somehow, more intimate, like the world had folded in around them to make space for this. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, whether Noah would speak again or retreat, whether this was the start of a flood or just a single drop. But it didn't matter. One word had been enough. Daddy. It wasn't a miracle. It was trust returned. Ethan had spent so long fearing he'd lost the right to that title, but Noah had handed it back to him, trembling and whispered, and that made it more sacred than anything spoken loudly. Still on the floor, holding the child he once thought he'd lost forever, Ethan finally let go of everything he'd been gripping since the day Helena died. The guilt, the distance, the constant second-guessing of whether he was doing enough, being enough, staying enough. All of it poured out quietly through the steady rise and fall of Noah's breathing and the warmth of a tiny hand against his chest. He kissed the top of his son's head, eyes closed, heart wide open. Riley remained engagement, but she didn't need to witness this. She had given them the bridge. Ethan had finally walked across it, and in the stillness that followed, there was nothing left to say, because sometimes one word is all it takes. And tonight, that word was Daddy. Something subtle had shifted in the house, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet transformation that sneaks up on you, like waking up one morning and realizing a weight you've been carrying is suddenly gone. The silence that once clung to the halls like dust was no longer heavy. It had changed. It had become comfort instead of absence. Ethan noticed it first in the kitchen. He and Noah were cracking eggs into a bowl, laughing because the shells kept slipping through his fingers, and Noah mimed a scolding shake of the finger with exaggerated seriousness. Ethan laughed, really laughed, and didn't care about the mess. He hadn't felt that light in years. Later, they watched old cartoons curled on the couch, Noah tucked into his side, blanket pulled to his chin. Ethan quoted the lines and did the voices. And when Noah giggled, it felt like fuel in his veins. Somewhere in all of that, pancakes, puzzles, story times, it hit Ethan. He wasn't watching Riley and Noah build a world anymore. He was in it. Not as a guest, not as a man haunted by the past, but as a father, fully present, fully there. And Riley, she wasn't on the sidelines either. He began to see her in a different light, not because of anything she did, but because of who she consistently was. She never sought attention, never demanded recognition, and yet she had quietly become the thread holding everything together. She was in the rhythm of their days, the softness of their routines, the laughter that had returned to the walls. Ethan began noticing the little things, how she always knew when Noah needed a break before he even showed signs of fatigue. How she left post-it notes on the fridge with silly reminders like, Dino pancakes on Sunday, or Ethan, buy more coffee or suffer. He found himself looking for those notes in the mornings and missing them when they weren't there. He noticed, too, the way she softened around Noah, not in pity but in respect. She gave him space but never distance, patience but never pressure. And he began to wonder how someone like her, someone who carried so much loss, who had no obligation to stay, had chosen to remain in a house that once only offered echoes and closed doors. The question crept up on him quietly one night as they sat together in the living room after Noah had fallen asleep. Noah was curled across his lap, arms wrapped around his dinosaur plush, breathing slow and even. Riley sat on the armchair, legs tucked beneath her, reading a worn paperback that she'd probably read 100 times already. Ethan watched them both for a long while, heart full in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't want the moment to end, and maybe that's why he asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question came out softer than he expected, almost afraid of the answer. Riley looked up, surprised, then placed her book face down on her lap. "Leaving?" she echoed. Ethan nodded, brushing a curl from Noah's forehead. "I know this wasn't supposed to be permanent. The job, I mean. You never said it was, but you've changed everything." He swallowed. "You made this place feel like a home again." Riley didn't answer right away. Her eyes dropped to the sleeping child in his arms, her expression unreadable. Ethan waited, unsure if he'd pushed too far. He continued, quieter now, "don't know what this looks like without you in it." It wasn't a romantic confession. It wasn't desperation. It was honest, vulnerable, real. Riley finally met his gaze, her voice steady but laced with something heavy. "I didn't change anything," she said. "This was always here. The warmth, the connection, the laughter. I just helped you both remember who you were before the silence." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned by the truth in her words. She wasn't diminishing her role. She was placing the credit where it belonged, on them. On the family that had existed all along, buried beneath grief and fear and time. He wanted to argue, to tell her she had changed things, that none of this would have been possible without her. But deep down, he knew what she meant. Riley had never imposed. She had only ever revealed. He looked down at Noah, sleeping soundly, and realized that his son wasn't just healing. He was remembering how to love, how to trust, how to be. And so was Ethan. Riley didn't save them. She made space for them to save each other. And maybe that was the greatest kind of help anyone could give. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. Not tension, not discomfort, just understanding. Ethan didn't press further. He didn't need to. Riley picked up her book again, smoothing the bent corner of a page as she settled back into her seat. But her eyes lingered on Ethan for just a second longer, soft and full of quiet knowing. "You didn't ask me to stay," she said, "but you're asking if I'll go." Ethan nodded once. She offered a faint smile and added, "That tells me what I need to know." And that was the end of it. They didn't talk more about the future that night. There were no promises, no dramatic pauses, just the hush of an evening that held more truth than any speech could. Ethan stayed on the couch long after Riley had gone upstairs, Noah still curled against him. The house, quiet but alive. The mansion, once a museum of memories and loss, no longer felt like a place to grieve. It felt like a place where things could grow again. Laughter didn't echo, it stayed. Grief didn't linger, it softened. And in the center of it all, Ethan saw a future forming. Not one he had orchestrated, but one that had grown in the cracks left by the past. As he looked down at his sleeping son and thought of the woman who had brought them back to themselves without ever asking for anything in return, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Not a grand, sweeping revelation, just a quiet, grounded truth. The heart that had once fled from connection was now choosing to remain, and that, more than anything else, meant they were finally becoming whole again. Time didn't heal everything, but it softened the sharpest edges. Months passed quietly, each day folding into the next, not in monotony but in rhythm. A new rhythm, one that belonged to them. Now Ethan no longer measured progress in Noah's words or milestones, but in how present he felt, in how laughter no longer startled him, in how silence didn't sting. Riley remained, not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as something constant. She helped reorganize the routines, not for control but for comfort. And slowly that house, once a monument to absence, became something else entirely. Ethan had been putting it off for weeks, maybe longer. The door down the hall had stayed closed, not because he had forgotten, but because he was waiting to know what it should become. Not a shrine, not a sealed tomb of memory. And then one morning, as Noah danced around the breakfast table talking about dinosaur books with real pictures, the answer came. The old room wouldn't be erased. It would be transformed, not to forget Helena, but to honor what she would have wanted. Life, learning, laughter. And so the room was emptied, not of memory, but of fear. Together they worked on it slowly. Riley painted the walls a warm color while Noah picked out cushions shaped like animals, and a bean bag he insisted looked like a volcano. Ethan spent hours assembling shelves, feeling a strange kind of peace in the repetition. Books filled the space quickly. Stories about adventures, feelings, space, and dreams. There were no rules in that room, no stiffness, just comfort. It was their new beginning, crafted carefully, layer by layer. And then came the plaque. Ethan had it made quietly, without fanfare. He didn't tell Riley or Noah until the day he screwed it into the door with steady hands. The name was simple, carved in clean lettering. Noah. Below it, space had been left blank intentionally. On a small table nearby, Ethan laid out 3 shallow dishes of paint, blue, green, and orange. "I thought we could add something," he said, looking first at Noah, then at Riley. "If you want to." Noah, eyes wide with wonder, dipped his hand in the paint without hesitation and pressed it beside his name. Riley followed, slower, more reflective. Her handprint landed beside Noah's in soft green. She didn't look at Ethan right away, but her hand stayed pressed longer than necessary. Ethan knelt down without saying a word. His hand went into the last dish, orange. He pressed it beside theirs, slightly overlapping Riley's fingertips. 3 prints side by side. No signatures, no labels, just belonging. Noah watched them both carefully, then tugged on Riley's sleeve. "Can I write something?" he asked, quiet but sure. Riley passed him the marker without speaking, His letters were crooked, uneven, slightly too big for the space, but they were perfect. He wrote one word beneath the prints: family. Riley turned her face quickly, but not fast enough for Ethan to miss the way her eyes flooded. She didn't sob. She didn't crumble, but her tears came steady, silent, as if that single word had released something she hadn't dared to name. Ethan stood, moved toward her slowly, and took her hand. Not like a thank you, not like a goodbye, but like an anchor, like someone reaching for what was already his. His voice was steady when he spoke. "If you stay," he said softly, "it can't be as an employee. I can't call this a job anymore. Not after everything. Not after what you've given us. If you stay, it has to be as someone who belongs here." Riley didn't respond at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door, on the paint still drying, on the little boy standing proudly beside it. She had once been afraid to stay, afraid that her presence was temporary, that eventually grief would close its doors again and shut her out. But that wasn't what this was. Ethan wasn't asking her to fill Helena's place. He wasn't asking her to save them. He was offering something quieter, something deeper, a place, a home. Riley turned to him, tears still shining but her expression clear. "I'm not staying because you're asking me to," she said. "I'm staying because this is where I'm supposed to be." Noah grabbed both their hands and squeezed, his grin crooked, a front tooth missing, his pride uncontainable. "We should write more words," he declared. "Like Dino Library or Rainbow Club." Riley laughed through her tears. Ethan smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. "We'll add whatever you want," he said. "This is your door." And as they stood together in front of it, the house felt completely changed. Not by renovation, not by time, but by presence. It no longer carried just the echoes of what was lost, but the voices of what had been found. A family, not born from blood, but from choice, from healing, from staying. The name on the door was Noah's, but the fingerprints, those messy, beautiful marks of belonging, were all of theirs. And in that house that had once fallen silent, everything finally spoke again. Even the things no one had dared to say before. We pour our hearts into every story we share here. Each one takes days of careful thought and love to create, always thinking of you on the other side of the screen. If this story touched you in some way, let us know in the comments. Your words mean more than you know. And if you haven't yet, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. It's a simple gesture, but it helps us continue bringing more heartfelt stories your way. Don't forget to check out the other videos we've prepared with just as much care. Thank you for being here with us, and we hope to see you again in the next one.